Today we've got arguably the most delicious Pokemon of them all, Slurpuff. It arrived in the Kalos region, based on many desserts. Its most direct inspiration is clearly a cake, or cupcake, which incidentally are sometimes called fairy cakes, if you're wondering how it got its typing. But it's also based on meringue, featuring fruit toppings. Other than inspiring trainers everywhere to forget their diet, Slurpuff also bears similarities to dogs and clowns. What an intriguing hodgepodge of inspiration. Today we're jumping into Slurpuff's competitive history, which is as rich as its design. And so we ask, how good was Slurpuff actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Buckle up because the history of Gen 6 Slurpuff is no cakewalk. Its go-to set was the Belly Drum variant, which doesn't seem threatening on a Pokemon with Slurpuff's unimpressive speed until you realize it has the Unburden ability, meaning as soon as it uses its item, its speed doubles, and that Belly Drum's health-having effect actually activates its Citrus Berry, meaning its Belly Drum actually gives +6 attack, +2 speed, and Slurpuff only loses 25% of its health while doing so, thanks to the Citrus Recovery. Yikes. Suddenly, Slurpuff's capacity for terror seems a whole lot more plausible. Even its meager base 80 attack stat is terrifying when boosted all the way to +6 in a single turn. It wasn't going to be doing much in the higher tiers yet, but Slurpuff quickly established itself as an absolute monster in XYNU, one of the absolute scariest Pokemon around. Its only flaw was a lack of coverage to hit steel types, but it was so ferocious against everything else that it didn't much matter. If you didn't have a steel type, you were toast, and if you had a steel type, you better preserve it at all costs, lest you get viciously swept. All it needed was that one turn of setup, and it was off to the races. Sure, it was on the riskier side, since it needed to set up or else it wasn't threatening, and seeing as it consuming its Citrus Berry meant it wouldn't be able to activate Unburden a second time, it actually had to commit, going all in once it Belly Drummed. Still, these were a completely worthwhile cost of business, given how unstoppable Slurpuff often was after a boost. Then Oraz came around. Remember how Slurpuff was unable to hit steals? Yeah, not anymore. It received Drain Punch. Yikes. Now, not only was it going to effortlessly shred steals that would withstand Play Rough, but Drain Punch's recovery, bringing it back up from the damage sustained during its setup turn, made it even more difficult to deal with, since you'd have to take it out in one shot. While Slurpuff wasn't exactly the tankiest Pokemon, this wasn't easy at all either, as it wasn't impervious to one-hit KOs. Most Pokemon that threatened it that way would get outsped and destroyed first, so you were restricted to extremely bulky Pokemon who generally weren't world beaters power-wise or priority, which generally wasn't going to get the job done either. Even multiple forms of priority from NU staples Kangaskhan and Hariyama wouldn't save you, since Slurpuff would heal out of range of the following one with each KO. As a result, Slurpuff was banned from NU very early into Oraz. Oh, but we're just getting started. RU had noticed Slurpuff's potential as well, and it began wreaking havoc on that metagame as well. The player base was generally not pleased with its presence, with the extremity it brought to the tier. It swept too hard, too easily, and forced excessive specificity in dealing with it, simply quote-unquote playing around it like one generally could against even the scariest threats was very rarely an option. But before it could really spiral out of control, it left RU, because it was also being spammed like heck in UU. There it had the same potential for destruction as in the two tiers below, but it was a little more on the specific side thanks to the much higher power level in the tier, not just in terms of opposing Pokemon capable of taking it on, though that was significant, but also in the Pokemon it had to compete with for a team slot. Plus, even though Slurpuff was theoretically a terror once boosted, it couldn't find that boost nearly as easily in the much stronger UU as it had been able to in RU and NU. Its safe setup spots were fewer, given its slightly below average bulk in the stronger metagame. It was excellent at punishing Hydreigon's Choice Lock stab, but beyond that it struggled to find consistency. In this vein, it competed with Florges, who was a more reliable sweeper because it didn't have to force the issue with limited and perfect setup opportunities, and it had an easier time setting up for the same reason that it was a better Pokemon overall. It actually took on opposing Pokemon defensively, which let it contribute to a team's defensive integrity and made it far easier to slap on teams. It was a staple for this reason. Similarly, Whimsicott's greater speed, secondary grass typing, and move pool full of prankster assisted utility also made it preferred as far as fairy types were concerned. Plus, Slurpuff's lower attack stat was more apparent in UU even at +6, and Choice Band Entei's powerful extreme speed, which hit it very hard, was everywhere, and thus also not doing it any favors. Slurpuff had its good points to be sure, but as its flaws became more and more apparent, its usage dropped accordingly, until finally a year and change after it had first risen to UU, it dropped back into RU. And remember how Slurpuff had been on the verge of brokenness when it first left RU? Well, that was in a metagame with Mega Steelix and Doubleblade around to check it. Neither of them were in RU anymore. Now it absolutely demolished just about everything. If you didn't have a Scavalier and keep it at a very high health, you were toast. It set up easily in this lower power environment. It swept easily against the less bulky Pokemon. Wheezing usage exploded, but even that had to be careful lest it get blown away by a +6 return. It was too difficult to stop Slurpuff from setting up, and once it set up, it was borderline impossible to not get completely run over. The options just weren't there. As such, Slurpuff got banned alongside fellow adorable destroyer of RU, Shaman, chalking up the second time that generation the player base swore off cakes. Slurpuff continued to be used sparsely in UU, but eventually that usage wasn't so sparse anymore. Several things changed. First, Entei's viability and usage dropped. There was a significant decrease in base 115 attack Bandit extreme speed, slicing Slurpuff's sweeps short. Furthermore, after Conkeldurr was banned, Mienshao and Heracross rose in usage and became among the best, most popular Pokemon around, providing Slurpuff ample setup opportunity against such common tier staples. Slurpuff found its home on hyper offense teams whose overwhelmingly fast flowchart sequencing pace and style was perfect for enabling its setups and sweeps, weakening the opponent and forcing a Pokemon it gets set up on. Speaking of which, Slurpuff's favorite setup target was Scarf Hydreigon. Indeed, previously hyper offense teams had been practically unviable because of how badly they were destroyed by Hydreigon, one of the tier's very best Pokemon. Slurpuff now not only single-handedly kept them from getting run over, it turned Hydreigon's presence into an opportunity to boost, and that was deadly. What about Slurpuff's attack stat? Well, that was easily compensated for by its new best friend, Lead Frostlass, whose spike stacking was monstrously consistent. Pretty much anything that wasn't Mega Absol was going to get spiked on. After Frostlass had laid down its spikes, Stealth Rockers like Crocodile and Nidoking followed it up, not only getting rocks, but maintaining them against Defoggers and more actively pressuring the opponent with their attacks. Thus, the domino effect began. This wasn't problematic in and of itself, according to most anyway, but where the greater player base agreed there was a problem was how devastating this setup was at enabling an unstoppable Slurpuff sweep. After Frostlass and the Rocker had started things off, and Slurpuff came in and set up, as it inevitably would against any UU team running the most viable Pokemon, the opponent was in no shape to withstand it anymore, especially with the rather limited number of answers to it to begin with. Mega Aggron, usually one of the most reliable Pokemon you could ask for, would now get worn down incredibly quickly. It wasn't long before the entire UU playerbase was genuinely destitute over the inability to withstand hyper offense teams, and particularly Slurpuff. The player base had completely consumed the metagame. Stopping it was absurdly difficult, even if you knew it was coming. Some thought that Frostlass was the issue, but dual screens hyper offense teams began popping up, and guess who was the most devastating abuser of them? Yup, Slurpuff. It swung the game too hard against Pokemon that were otherwise very good against hyper offense. It could even set up against Mega Aerodactyl. There's nothing wrong with being good against the usual checks to a playstyle, of course, but Slurpuff was too good. With the reward for its successful setup too great, too much of a punish for Pokemon that generally provided stability, its warping effect was so great that many top players believe Slurpuff made the tier almost unplayable. The advantage in almost all matchups lay on the Slurpuff side. It was all other teams could do to simply not get decked by the team's standard lines of play, while the Slurpuff team was generally able to overwhelm, not unskillfully, necessary, but with great ease, given that it wasn't just Slurpuff, but also monsters like Quiver Dance Venomoth and Dragon Dance Gyarados. Team building to try and contain the threat was similarly nightmarish, an overtly extreme game of pick your poison, because the answers to Slurpuff-led hyper offense were so specific and demanding, and including them left one much less apt at taking on the rest of the metagame. It wasn't just taking on Slurpuff that was insane, although make no mistake, that was exceedingly difficult, but it was taking on Slurpuff and friends that was just unfair. They were simply exerting too much pressure, as enabled by the cake. Teams using Empoleon as their steal got demolished with no recourse. There was a dearth of priority that might not even help, since Drain Punch heals off chip. Players were relying on not Mega Evolving their Aerodactyl so they could switch in as Slurpuff Belly Drum, since base Aerodactyl could use Unnerve as its ability and prevent Slurpuff from eating its Citrus Berry, thereby blocking Unburden. This was both ridiculous and not even particularly reliable. Slurpuff made it difficult to the point of absurdity to contain hyper offense's cascading threats, as it had so few answers, and pairing it with the likes of Gyarados created ridiculous win-win scenarios where those answers were effortlessly abused or they weren't there and Slurpuff won. As a result, Slurpuff eventually received the ban hammer, capping off an absolutely insane Generation 6 that saw it banned 3 times from NU, RU, and even UU. After it rocketed off a riotous start in its debut generation, Slurpuff had, by contrast, a very simple yet still successful Generation 7. It dropped to the earliest iteration of NU, where it was banned immediately. We can't stress enough how early and fast this was. NU wasn't even a real, fully formed tier yet. It was in the beta stage, and Slurpuff got quick banned from that. Its utter ravaging of the tier was that thorough and that immediate. The player base had learned their lesson from Gen 6, and rightly decided there was to be no tolerating such nonsense. As such, Slurpuff received a rapid-fire ban hammer, never to return to NU again. Beyond that, it didn't do much. The immensely power-crept RU was stronger, faster, and bulkier, and downright crawling with great answers. Metagross alone, one of the best Pokemon around, completely dominated. Slurpuff had occasional use, of course, as it was potentially one of the most explosive, destructive Pokemon available, but it had a seriously difficult time getting this going with any consistency whatsoever, thus relegating it to gimmick tier. But hey, seeing as how resoundingly it got banned from NU, Gen 7 was still a good one for it, all things considered. Generation 8 saw Slurpuff again finding some scattered use in RU, given its unique trait of setting up in front of Noivern, but it had powerful competition given the number of similarly game-ending Pokemon that generally matched up against the metagame better, namely Cloyster and fellow Belly Drum user Linoon. Slurpuff was also hurt badly by the deletion of Return from its moveset, leaving it unable to hurt poison types, and thus losing to major threats Crobat and Vileplume even at +6. Why, Game Freak? Why did Return have to go? First Stoutland and now this? Anyway, all was not lost, for Slurpuff returned to NU, and once again, it absolutely destroyed the tier, pulling the same antics as always. The limited Pokedex especially had left the metagame much weaker, and thus much more unable to stop it from setting up or blasting everything apart after a boost. Slurpuff's place in NU could accurately be described as have Garbodor or lose the Pokemon. Nothing else could take it on. The lower power metagame reliant on the likes of Clefairy was basically taking on their equivalent of Mega Rayquaza every time Slurpuff successfully pulled off its belly drum, which again was incredibly easy because again, this was a tier whose average power level was hovering around the likes of Clefairy. The only way to quote-unquote reliably beat Slurpuff, besides using Garbodor, was to sacrifice Cofagrigus to its +6 play rough, which would give Slurpuff Mummy and thus take away its unburdened fueled double speed, so then afterwards you could outspeed it. This was, to say the least, an unpleasant method of handling it. It didn't take much imagination to pair Slurpuff with Pokemon that loved the removal of Cofagrigus, to say nothing of the absurdity of having to run Garbodor or Cofagrigus if you didn't want to lose outright. As such, Slurpuff notched its third ban from NU in as many generations until the Isle of Armor DLC came around. At that point, enough Pokemon had been released for NU to have undone major power creep. Maybe it'll be palatable now, the player base said, and re-released Slurpuff into the tier. A week later, cake strained bruises across their faces, the player base banned Slurpuff from NU once again, citing it as having played a little too rough for the 4th time in 3 generations. Finally, Slurpuff even made its Uber's debut this gen. It found use as a solid Sticky Web lead. With Focus Sash, it gets Sticky Web up reliably, and the use of the Sash would activate unburdened, letting Slurpuff set the table for his teammates further with Yawn, Misty Explosion, or sometimes even Endeavor. Its access to Magic Coat also bounced back attempts to get Stealth Rock up against it. As a Sticky Web user, Slurpuff was quite decent. It was less used because its viability was tied to that of Sticky Web teams as a whole, and they weren't the most reliable given the prominence of heavy-duty boots. Furthermore, Shuckle was often employed as a Sticky Web user that also had access to Stealth Rock, as opposed to Slurpuff, which necessitated another team slot for rocks. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was more limiting. Still, it had a real niche in Ubers, capping off another majorly successful generation for it. And that's it. So how good was Slurpuff actually? Well, it was a lower tier terror, its belly drum unburdened antics having been wreaking havoc ever since its debut, where it got banned from all of NU, RU, and UU, despite its unassuming stats. It's so strong and fast after one turn of boosting that it immediately becomes one of the most polarizing extreme Pokemon around, with very few checks and a general inability to play around it, especially since it received the steel crushing and damage healing Drain Punch and Oras. It proceeded to get banned from NU again in Gen 7 and twice in Gen 8. If there's anything we've learned, it's that Slurpuff cannot cannot be allowed in NU. Well, Gen 9 Power Creep would probably see about that, but then again, a terrestrializing Slurpuff sounds incredibly frightening. Gen 8 also saw Slurpuff used in Ubers. The sky's really the limit for it seems. Overall, Slurpuff has been highly successful. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Game for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Slurpuff? Would you buff it? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazon Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray Ray, Daniel Isbeast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, Skylaria, and Jack G for their support of our videos. And follow my crew in these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.